"Hail, Arthur, King of the Britons!" cried Pythons of Monty with stories to tell. But when did Camelot first become written? A welcome to the House of Revel. Hello and welcome back to House of Revels, the Theatre Through the Ages podcast. I'm Mingma.
And I'm Olivia, and we are theatre practitioners taking you on a journey through the history of theatre in Britain.
From naught to now.
Each episode we discuss a different theatre style, its context, origin and form, and then we score said theatre style in 4 different categories.
Finally, we decide whether this style deserves to join the illustrious House of Revels, the great and noble hall for only the best of British theatre.
In this episode, we are discussing the matter of Britain. It feels like we're kind of going, right, we need to discuss the matter of Britain. Like, we need to talk about Britain.
Yeah. I was waxing lyrical about all my interest in this research last night, and my mum just went, "Why is it called matter?" And I think it is a fair point.
Yeah.
It's coined by a French poet called Jean Baudel in the late 12th century, and he says that in Europe at this time there are 3 great literary cycles going on, which are the matter of Rome, which covers all of the Greek myths retold and Roman myths retold and Aeneas and all that kind of stuff. We have the matter of France, which is about Charlemagne and about fighting back the Mongols and the Paladins and the Saracens and the Moors and all this kind of stuff. And then we have the matter of Britain, which, as we're doing a British theatre podcast, that is the one we are covering.
It's our focus. Okay, that's good.
So it is a style of, it was more like a genre of song performed by troubadours and minstrels and jongleurs. And it features the stories of Brutus of Troy, Cymbeline, Lear of Britain, and most famously the stories of the Arthurian cycle. This is the first theatricalization of King Arthur.
Okay, and we know King Arthur then, don't we? So, explain to us quickly. King Arthur, what's he most famous for? Is there a round table? Are there some sword in the stones?
All that fun stuff. Well, it's all going to come up in this, but I think general ideas of myth of Arthur are love triangles, it's sword in the stone, it's Excalibur, it's Camelot, it is the wizard Merlin, Morgan Le Fay, Mordred, all this kind of stuff. And Arthur is a myth that has built up roughly from the 6th century, and just everyone's piled on X, Y, and Z as we've gone through the centuries. And so actually what we're looking at today is the beginning of creating a myth of Britain through poetry and through theatre and through song. And so these are the earliest versions of Arthur as told and as created in this time. I think people will find it quite surprising just how much of the elements of the Arthurian legend come from effectively 900 years ago.
I mean, this is kind of, as we talked about in previous episodes, I think, like, this is the big myth that we have, a big legend that we have that survives from pre-Norman invasion, don't we?
Yes and no. It was written down for the first time by a good old guy called Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote his great history of Britain, and it's pretty mythical. And within kind of 50 years, everyone was saying this isn't real history. Come on, guys. But it captures imagination. And he was writing in 1135, and he claims that he got all the stories from a Welsh Bishop of Oxford who knew the truth. And we can get into this a bit more, but it's an interesting thing of myth and of story, and also remembering that fact didn't particularly matter at this point either.
So context, just for listeners who haven't listened before, is where we discuss the current day events. So as this form developed, what else was going on in history? What social, economical, political movements might affect performance?
Brilliant. So yes, I think that I'm not going to repeat everything we did in Laser Courtly Love, because Laser Courtly Love are of exactly the same time, but a distinct genre. So in some ways we've divided because this matter of Britain is so important for today and for the style of it was in. So if you'd like more absolute context of what happened between 1066 and now, which is roughly 1154 to 1200, is kind of the period we're covering, mostly around 1154 though, and most of the texts we're looking at today, then check out our episode of Laser Courtly Love. But the TLDR is that England is part of an empire ruled by the Plantagenet dynasty that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees at this time. after so much war, after the anarchy of Stephen and Matilda, after all of this time, there's a great freedom of thought throughout Europe at this time, with a free exchange of ideas between courts and places. And there's just this enormous burgeoning of thought, philosophy, culture, everything. It's all kind of happily marinading in quite a warm climate as well. This is very warm. This is a very warm century, which I think is underestimated sometimes in its importance. This is also the time when many nobles have been / will go on crusades to the Holy Land. That also means there's a great exchange of ideas and thought with the Islamic world, that there's this real kind of connection which doesn't just come through war, but there's also through peace and through trade. And think about the wandering scholars who are wandering between courts to exchange ideas, and also the storytellers did the same thing. Also worth bearing in mind while we're talking about this, that as England is conquered by the Normans, the language of court and church in England at this time were Norman French and Latin. So a lot of the texts we're using, though they might have been written by Englishmen and British in Britain, they will still be in French or Latin or the ruling court, basically. And Liv, is there anything else from last time you think we should add in?
Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II were like patrons of these two forms that we're talking about, the Lays of Courtly Love and The Matter of Britain.
They're both fascinated by literacy and culture, and they're very strong proponents of it throughout their courts, and kind of in changing behaviour and soft power and diplomacy through words and through thought and through stories, rather than just, big bad sword, I'm going to cut you.
Big bad sword, I'm going to cut you. I think that's pretty much everything. I mean, I'm trying to think. You've pretty much pretty neatly summed it up. Everything we did in last episode. Well, not everything we did in last episode. Okay, so we should probably mention, if you haven't listened to our previous episode about Lays of Courtly Love, Lays of Courtly Love it's kind of the idea of like noble love. So Eleanor of Aquitaine, she changed the way nobles thought about love, kind of. So the idea was that knights had been quite horrible towards women, and suddenly there's this new idea of how love should be respectful, and it's unrequited, and you can't, to make your love public is to like crush love, and you're supposed to be jealous. And then you have people like Marie of France, who's coming along and writing these epic love poems on stories.
It's very much it's a transformation in the way that love is perceived, which is very much around the nobility of love and bringing in this idea of chivalry and of knight's love and honour and duty. And it all kind of comes into a new knight's code. And part of the knight's code is how you might treat love. And a true knight must have a lady who he will do things for, and doing something in the name of love is very important, and this idea of love for love's sake.
It's kind of like this idealization of putting love on a bit of a pedestal rather than doing things for lust.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. I think that covers it roughly.
So the origins then. This is the section where we discuss the origins of the theatre style. We trace its beginnings and what influenced its development. So, what are the origins of The Matter of Britain?
So, there are a fair number, but get some basic history out of the way. One little origin is the existence of Brittany. And remember, Liv, way back when we were explaining what happened after the Romans left? Do you want to give us a quick summary?
Yes. So, when the Romans left, there were a kind of series of waves of invasions, and most people scattered to the fringes of Britain. So, like to Cornwall and to Wales and to North.
To North. Forget Scotland, they're just North.
They just like scattered, they spread out, and then England became 7 kingdoms.
Yes.
And they also some of the Britons went across the Channel to Brittany.
Exactly that.
Formed Brittany.
Yes. So some of the British Roman Britons, Anglo-Roman. Some of the Anglo-Roman Britons, in the face of the Germanic tribe invasions, fled across the Channel and formed Brittany, which is the land of Bretons, quite like Normandy is the land of Northmen. Incidentally, this is also the time when we have the first reference to Arthur, which is in a scrap of poetry from this time, from a poem called the Gogodin. I think that's how you say it. Where apparently the warrior Gwairder. There's a lot of W's and a lot of D's in the name, and I apologise. Was killed and slayed his enemies, but he was no Arthur. So Arthur doesn't appear, but he seems to be referenced as this kind of paragon virtue and of like the ultimate something. And that's the first real reference we have of Arthur. Let's move forward to 1150 when we're talking. And Brittany is not part of the Plantagenet Empire, but its empire is the only neighbour. If you look at a map of this time, we've got like this enormous red kind of corridor all the way through France and up into England and into Wales and co. And we've just got this little sock of white next to it, which is Brittany. As Brittany is independent, but the empire is its only landlocked neighbour, there's guaranteed to have been a lot of exchange of ideas and trade and stories, so new Norman nobles who've only recently arrived in Britain might have already known about old Celtic myth and British myth and this kind of stuff before having arrived in Britain.
Okay, yeah, so you've got this little area which is Britain, but across near France.
Yes, exactly.
Well, Normandy, yeah.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. So
continuing on from that point, there's actually clearly Welsh and English and Breton minstrels and jongleurs, I'm going to go with that, jongleurs, were very skilled at this time. So we know that a Welsh or Breton jongleur, Brery, was known to have been at Poitiers in 1135, which was where Eleanor was growing up. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the wife of Henry II. Mm-hmm. We also know that all of his stories were from Celtic traditions about heroes who suffered in spells, and they had quests and endured tests, and they fairies and all this kind of glorious mythic stuff. Eleanor of Aquitaine was growing up hearing these Celtic stories in her own court in France.
I see, so there's definitely an influence there if you've got this Welsh jongleur.
Yes. Similarly, Marie of France, who we spoke about last session, though French, spent most of her life in England, and as argued by Melvyn Bragg in The Adventure of English, which I mentioned far too much, but I love that book, so there's my nerd kind of read this reference, that she would have been inspired by tales roaming the country at that time. So though everything is written in Norman French and in Latin, living in Britain, there clearly was a very strong storytelling tradition, and a lot of the formats and a lot of the tales and plots were coming through from this Celtic myth. So yes, the big next tradition as such, which origin of this style, is that the Saxon chronicling tradition was undimmed. So the Anglo-Saxon chronicle was still going strong, and there was still a tradition of writing in Britain even after the Norman invasion. And one absolute direct origin for all of this style is a certain book by Geoffrey of Monmouth, who we've already mentioned, called Historia Regnum Britanniae, which was written around 1135-1136. And it is his history of the kings of Britain, written in 12 books. So I'm just going to give, I'm not mentioning all the books, but I'm mentioning most of them. Okay. I'm giving a basic idea of where we're going. In his 12-book cycle, Book 1 follows Aeneas's great-grandson, Aeneas as of founder of Rome from the Aeneid. His great-grandson Brutus is banished from Rome and eventually is directed by the goddess Diana to found Britain. Fun fact, Britain after himself, Brutus, on the Isle of Albion. So yay, we're all named after some bloke called Brutus. And he lands at Totnes, which I find hilarious, and I don't know why. So yes, that's book 1. It shows our found... It's also quite funny because, as we spoke about with the Vikings, seems to be this weird thing that everyone has to be descended from Trojans and from Rome in some form, all civilized cultures. And so here's our founding myth, which connects us to that.
Yeah. Goddesses and
yeah, fun. Anyway, book 2 mainly focuses on the reign of King Lear and his succession crisis with his daughters Goneril, Regan and Cordelia. Does anyone recognise these people?
Oh.
Yeah, come on to them. Anyway, so that's book 2. Book 4 is the time of Julius Caesar and the Roman rule, and eventually the rule of King Lucius, supposedly under Roman occupation, who is the first Christian king of the kings of Britain. Book 7 is the prophecies of Merlin, which is a massive tangent, which basically for 500 years, so many kings were trying to justify themselves by retroactively adding themselves into the prophecies of Merlin. So all of these prophecies are incredibly vague, and then Edward III going, oh, I suit this prophecy, therefore I should be doing this because I am destined by Merlin in our history.
Gosh.
Fun.
And it's a myth, it's not true.
But does it matter? Again, it's this really interesting point at this time that it's stories, but it is our history, so why? Yeah. Anyway, fun. Book 8 enters Uther Pendragon. Ooh. And his fights against the Saxons. Book 9 and 10, Uther's son, Arthur Pendragon, defeats the Saxons and conquers most of northern Europe. While fighting the Romans, as he intends to become the Emperor of Rome, his nephew, Mordred, seduces Guinevere and seizes the throne.
Okay.
Book 11 and 12, Arthur defeats and kills Mordred, but is mortally wounded and is carried off to the Isle of Avalon. The line of British kings continues until the defeat of Cadwallader, and so the Saxon Athelstan rules all of Logria, which is the Geoffrey of Monmouth's word for England. So that is the main points in the history of Britain. By 1190, people were calling it fiction, but it had already had 50 years to inform the minds of young kings and queens and songs, and it's never really lost that hold since.
I think, yeah, it definitely, I can see it appealing because we're talking about Romans left Britain, Anglo-Saxons came to Britain when? About 500? So you're talking about something 600 years ago when they were writing it. So we're talking about the seemingly distant past then, in the 1100s. So I can see that appeal of, well, you didn't know, and it felt like a long time ago, so it could have happened. But it's also not too close that it's like, oh, that's ridiculous. And it's not like it has, I'm not saying it's not like that fiction has any consequence, but it's like, as long as we get to the point with the Anglo-Saxons coming in, then we're fine. As long as we reach a historically accurate point that we can go from.
I think it's one of those interesting things of, I think we all reach for our lineages. And particularly at this time when there's this great burgeoning of culture and of X, Y, and Z, and everyone's rediscovering the Romans and the Greeks and thoughts and ideas and philosophy and all this kind of stuff. And there is this gap of very, very little surviving record. And so I understand why. And actually, to be fair to him, I kind of wonder whether this is almost a Tolkien-y thing of, well, let's give ourselves a great myth and to patch the gaps. And it's not like this is unheard of, like the Aeneid, Virgil was literally commissioned to write the history, which would then become the history in Rome. So I can see that. But it's also interesting that you don't know how much he fictionalized and how much he actually believed and how much... I mean, I think most of the time he knew it was fiction. But Merlin is based on a Welsh character, who I'm not even going to try and pronounce, but it's something like Myrddin or something like that, this wise man. So there's clearly just fragments which have melded and potted. And also this is only one publication of this. We don't again know how much of Arthur was in the 9th century, which then was but I'm just surprised just how much of the bare bones of the Arthurian legend are here in 1135,
ready to go,
written down. Already called Pendragon, already has a sword, already has has his castle, already has a nephew called Mordred, already has a father, already has Merlin.
Okay, I'm with you. How popular was this history? Would everyone have known about it, or would it have just been a sort of nobles only club? Or
it was pretty wildly popular, I think. Do you remember that this was written in 1135 and a lot of the drama of the Matter of Britain happens around 1150. So within 15 years, this kind of story is all through Europe. To us, it looks like this is the flagship model, which then everyone else kind of goes off from. But we don't actually know how much was already in public consciousness in Europe
it could
beforehand.
Be that he's Geoffrey's taking things and putting them into a book rather than creating them and explaining them. Okay.
Yeah. How much is his creativity and how much is really him compiling? But in this kind of point, he was wildly popular, I think, is the main point. And Henry, in particular, he was so seduced by the Arthurian legends that he actually carried out excavations at Glastonbury to try and find Avalon.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
Just how amazing is that in terms of just how much this was totally in possession. On my cousin's birthday, we went to Glastonbury for the first time. And it really is quite extraordinary when you're there. And I discovered that the tour of Glastonbury is actually entirely natural. It's not that it was man-made construction of this. It's literally just like the Somerset Plains were flooded right up until the 14th century, I think. And it was a completely different landscape to what it was now. And then there was actually a man-made operation to drain it, so that farmland could be produced, so it could be much easier, X, Y, and Z. But all through that time of marshland with slight fog over the marshes and of, people who had to go in boats across Somerset, the Glastonbury tour is a natural, enormous mound coming out. So you can get a real idea of where Avalon came from in terms of in the public consciousness of this slightly magical place. And actually sitting at the top of the tour and looking out across this incredibly flat area, even nowadays, you really get the idea of where some of our myths come from, of the giant who lies sleeping, because you have these enormously flat blocks and then just like another hill appears at this point, just boom, and then something else here, and you can see just how that could look like a giant on its side. You can totally see why people thought of it as holy and why it felt, and why it still feels holy now in its own way. It's something quite special. It's interesting.
Oh, I agree.
So yeah, I'll put in geography into Origins as well then. Just for the
put it in. Why not? Expand that GCSE profile.
Yeah.
Moving on to the form itself. So these are the main features of the theatre style. So Mingma, talk us through what's happening. Give us the lowdown.
What's been going on? All right, so in brief, the Matters of Britain are a reworking of the myths of Britain into a late 12th, early 13th century style of songs and poetry, which attracted troubadours, authors and poets from around Europe, all adding their own cultural twists to the retellings. So everyone realised that this story is a winner, and they all just kind of jumped on the bandwagon.
We'll take your book and we will adapt it into a musical.
Aha! Yes, exactly that. By modern standard.
Yeah.
So yes, as I said before, Jean Baudel defined 3 literary traditions going on in Europe at the time, or 3 matters, in his poem La Chanson des Saxons, which is the Song of the Saxons. And as I said before, Matters of Rome, the retelling of Greek myths; Matters of France, Paladins versus Charlemagne and the Wars of the Moors and the Saracens, which is the Mongol invasion. Finally, the Matters of Britain, which are the legendary kings of Britain during this time.
It's interesting that it's Rome, Britain and France, because if we're part of this Plantagenet Empire, it's an interesting separation between Britain and France, is all I'm pointing out.
I mean, I find it fascinating as well, because I've been trying quite hard to emphasise the fact that we are part of an empire where the greater part of the lands of the empire are in France. And obviously France is a much smaller area as such. I think it's a really interesting question about kind of cultural identity. I mean, I try and emphasise the fact we're in an empire, because I think it's very easy for us to go, oh, well, we were the centre, because obviously we were the centre. You know, and actually, like, look at the lands which are in France. How do we know actually what the cultural feeling was? But the fact, as you're right, the fact that we are one of 3. And I think actually France is an interesting question as well, because France was much smaller than the Plantagenet France/Britain empire which is going on. And I'm sure actually a lot of it was into Germany. I have no answer to it.
No, I just think it's fascinating that we have this. It suggests that we very much do have a separate cultural identity to France and the rest of the empire.
And also that it's a respected one at this time. In general, what these troubadours and these poets and these songwriters are all doing is that they are adding style and genre to the old stories, and older traditions are also melded into the stories told by Geoffrey. So Geoffrey is almost, Geoffrey of Monmouth and the history of the kings of Britain is like the spine of this story, and then everyone else is just kind of letting it bloom. They're going, oh, I'm just going to tag this bit on and that bit on, and they're, creating their tree of
fiction, basically like fanfic, Mingma.
It literally is, yeah. Except, it's legitimate fan fiction, I think is the way of putting it.
I was going to say something about King Lear. In terms of Shakespeare, what Shakespeare did with King Lear was he literally went, this is the legend, what happened if this happened? And that's a really interesting... So he kind of like fanficked King Lear as well. I mean, this is later down and I'm just chatting shit. But it's that thing of taking something and going, what if this and this and this and this?
Yeah. Well, Lear is actually a really interesting one because, Geoffrey told his story, then someone else told his story, then Henry of Huntingdon took it on, and then someone else took it on, and then Shakespeare based it off like the 4th iteration from Geoffrey of Monmouth. And yet, the spine of the story is still there. I think it's... I went down a YouTube rabbit hole when I was in the middle of researching this, and I was watching a really good summary of The Legend of Robin Hood. The narrator was trying to explain at the end was, why does Robin Hood still exist, and why is it difficult to put it into one definite tradition, like with King Arthur? We know what all the characters are, we know what all the tropes are, but why can't we just have one definitive cycle of what happened? And her argument was actually, this is such a great melting pot for any kind of writer. You have ready-made characters, but enough space to add your own thing and add it into this whole world, and you're allowed to do it because it's been fanficked for 900
it's ready
years.
To go. I'm trying to think of the modern day equivalent to that.
Yeah. I think the modern day equivalent would be I think actually the modern equivalent is just the enormous once one person creates one great story in a world like Game of Thrones, then suddenly they plan 4 other series set in that world with slightly different things, bringing in slightly something different, and
But it's pretty unique, is what I'm trying to say. I think to have, like almost stock, well, not they're not stock characters, but to have these characters that you can use in.
Well, yes, and Arthur's actually an interesting one as well, because Morgan Le Fay is a very interesting character who her intentions and character change dramatically through every single retelling. If you look on her Wikipedia page of her cultural mentions, there's literally a bar kind of saying, is she good in this story? Is she bad? Or is she neutral? Because you have, and especially as kind of like the courtly love triangle happens, and suddenly you can change the motivation. You can make Arthur good, but then that makes Lancelot bad, and that makes Guinevere even worse. But if you make Lancelot good, that makes Arthur bad, but makes Guinevere quite virtuous. And where does Mordred fit in? And you can change so much about dynamics and retelling the characters.
That sounds like a video game to me. Like you could develop it and then you could select which version you'd like to play.
Yeah, I think it would be a very cool video game. Actually, here we go. Liv, we got a pitch.
I just gotta learn how to program, and then we're good to go.
Right. So particularly at this time. So again, we're keeping it right back in this time of the initial melding of new/old myths. Some popular insertions into the stories of this time were the Christianization of stories. So the quest for the Grail comes up. It's interesting as well, remembering that the Crusades are happening at this point. So questing. Old characters in their own right now become part of the story. People like Percival, Sir Gawain, Tristan and Isolde. All of these characters who might have been part of different myths and different traditions are lumped in with Arthur. It's very useful that Arthur has knights, because then you could have any number of knights and just add in, he was Knight of Arthur as well.
Just add it in.
Actually, my favourite one of this is that Lancelot is fanfic.
So Lancelot, so remind me. So the thing is, Mingo, so every time I hear Lancelot, I think of the song from Spamalot, where it's like, his name is Lancelot, he likes to dance a lot. So I don't actually really know that much about Lancelot, apart from the fact that he may or may not be gay, according to this song.
So Lancelot is a character mostly from Cléchen de Troyes, if that's how you pronounce it, who is one of the great poets who was really pushing the development of the Matter of Britain and of all these stories and telling different stories and telling endless sequels and this kind of stuff. And Lancelot was a great character of the courtly love tradition. So a virtuous, chivalrous knight who is wonderful and is great and is kind of personifies everything to do with this idea of love for love's sake. I will quest, I will be noble for my love for X, Y, and Z. And he is added into the Arthurian legends, and his love is Guinevere. Right. And we've had a real issue since then, since this time of courtly love and adultery not being a problem, and X, Y, and Z trying to deal with this. So originally Guinevere was always Arthur's queen, as we've seen by Geoffrey of Monmouth. She's there as his queen. And then Lancelot comes in and is virtuous to her lady. And so we end up with this love triangle of the fact that Lancelot is devout to his lord, Arthur. And there is kind of like love and devotion there. And this isn't odd either in the way they tell it. This is expected and normal, that he loves Arthur, but he also loves Guinevere in a very actual romantic love way, chivalric love. As we romanticise the Arthurian legends, Lancelot is part of that because the courtly love tradition is going on. And basically, ever since this time of courtly love, everyone's had an issue with it.
But also, as one of my friends always said, she says, I think so many of the world's problems would be solved if we weren't all that hung up about monogamy. Like, if we all were like, oh, yeah, no. It's like, actually, a lot of all fiction, a lot of films, like, affairs wouldn't be a big issue. It's a thing. So
it's a thing.
Let's not impose our modern day criteria on the layers of courtly love and the lance triangle.
I think it is really tough because we just can't understand courtly love nowadays. We actually can't, in terms of their moral code with it, and Christian, but also this, but also it's really interesting. I can't understand it, and I have to try and let it go. The fact
just
I can't
accept it for what it is.
Yeah, it's really bizarre. So yes, actually not just with Lancelot, but courtly love in general gets a pretty good showing in this initial flourishing of the Matter of Britain in our period right now. Some authors and poets involved include Robert Wace, who wrote Roman de Brut, which is a retelling of Geoffrey of Monmouth. So Brutus the Roman, basically. But he also goes through, but he uses him as the main guy. We've got Robert de Boron, who writes the history of Merlin. We've got, and Cléchen de Troyes is the most famous, and he actually was working, again from fun fact of history of last episode, he was working in Marie of France's, different Marie of France, too many Maries of France, court in France, which is Eleanor's daughter from her first marriage to the King of France. And he is kind of, in some ways, considered now the most famous gatekeeper of kind of... Apparently it's called courtly love Arthuriana, which I think just sounds like it comes out of a manga.
Arthuriana.
Arthuriana. Yeah, so the most popular stories were to readapt the Arthurian legends and add in other people's stories and traditions, saying, actually, this is part of it, and stamping on a... I mean, to be honest, we today, if we retell a fairy tale, quite often it's very feminist rather than not. They're stamping their own style and genre onto old stories. So that's what's going on in plays. So, that being said, the play I've chosen to look at is not a Arthurian legend. Well, it's one of the linked ones.
How could you?
Shocker. As we are a British theatre podcast, let's look at Thomas of Britain's Tristan.
Okay.
So, this is based off the legend of Tristan and Isolde, which I'm sure everyone's heard of if they don't actually know what it's about.
Okay, no, I have not heard of it, Mingma. So
have you not?
I don't hang around with historians or people who talk about anything remotely interesting or intellectual. I thought of a good example. When you said fairy tales, I went, like Into the Woods, how they take all the fairy tale characters and put them all together and be like, actually, this one is this one, and the prince is this one, and he's this one.
Actually, that's a really good example. Yeah, Into the Woods is a great example of this.
Yeah. Anyway, so yes, Tristan and Isolde, what's happening?
Tristan and Isolde is an adulterous love affair story. It's a tragic, courtly love, adulterous love affair between the Cornish knight Tristan and the Irish princess Isolde. And it's one of those ones where love is beautiful yet doomed. This early version, which we're looking at by Thomas Britton, is likely written sometime between 1155 and 1160, possibly for Eleanor of Aquitaine, but certainly for Henry II's British court. And remember that Henry was actually sworn in as king in 1154, so this is very early in his reign.
Bang on, yeah.
Which is quite interesting. It was clearly helped along, to use a better word, by Wace's Roman de Brut. Yeah, and this is basically a fan fiction, if we're using those terms, of inserting a previous story into the character, into Arthurian legend to get more coverage. Unfortunately, the text is incomplete. Only 3,300 lines of verse survive to today, and mostly that's from the latter part of the story. And it's estimated it represents about a sixth of the original.
That's like more than 18,000 lines long.
Yeah, it's enormous if you think about it. That's a feature film.
Yeah.
This isn't just poetry as we think about it. This is a proper entertainment in the evenings for people to listen and enjoy and hear. Although much is lost of the poem, a lot can be deduced and reconstructed from later adaptations. So, basic outline of the plot is that Tristan is a boy born from noble birth, but he is stolen away, and he has all those kind of things of a boy who doesn't know who his real parents are, but is noble in spirit and in love, and through a lot of excursions involving Norwegian pirates and hunting, where he knows far more about hunting duties than X, Y, and Z, he makes his way back to his original birth court, which is the court of King Mark of Cornwall at Tintagel. And King Mark admires this noble character and this noble man and brings him into his court and this as a young boy. And then a few years later, his foster parents arrive and tell the full story of Tristan. And King Mark is overjoyed to find out that Tristan is his nephew and vows that he will never wed so that Tristan may gain his throne once he dies. So then we have many more quests of Tristan being noble and wonderful and all that fun, boring stuff. Eventually, there is a problem in the Kingdom of Cornwall that they are paying a toll to the Irish, and they want to stop paying the toll. And when they do, the giant Morald comes over, and he is the brother of the Queen of Ireland, and to try and extract the toll. And Tristan valiantly slays him. And in the slaying of him, he is wounded by Morald's spear. The spear is cursed, and the giant tells him that the only person who can save him is his sister. And my sister will never cure you because X, Y, and Z. And Tristan doesn't seem to be particularly worried about this, but then the wound does begin to fester. And knowing what the giant told him, he asks his friends to put him into a boat to cross the Irish Sea and he sits at the bottom playing his harp most kind of beautifully and kind of sadly, as he doesn't have any strength for anything apart from playing his wonderful harp. And eventually his boat bumps into Dublin. He introduces himself as Tantris, the minstrel. And he's playing beautifully, and the queen is enamoured by this poor man who's on the brink of death, and he says that he was wounded and he was separated from his friends, and she takes pity and says, if you teach my daughter Iseult how to play and how to sing, then I will cure you. And he agrees. And so as he's being cured, he teaches Iseult how to play and how to sing, and she sings most beautifully, and it's all very happy, X, Y, and Z. Then he goes back to Mark and tells King Mark about his adventures and why he's cured. And King Mark is enamoured by the story of Iseult and of this girl's beauty and her exquisite voice. And meanwhile, while Tristan has been away, the barons have been working on King Mark, saying, you shouldn't be vowing to let this nephew, who supposedly just appeared, to take your throne. You should make sure you have an heir. And so he eventually says, I will only marry Iseult if I marry anyone, because she sounds so fair and so beautiful. So then Tristan goes back to Ireland to try and gain her hand for King Mark, and finds out that her hand is promised to the man who slays a dragon, which has been terrorising their area. Through a few different interesting cycles, he does slay the dragon, and he also takes its tongue. And there's a whole confusion over who actually slay the dragon, but because he has the tongue of the dragon, he proves that he is the man who slayed the dragon. In the midst of this, of course, Iseult and her mother recognise Tantris the minstrel, going, what are you doing slaying dragons?
Yeah.
And Iseult realises that he killed her uncle, Morold, because he has a nick in his sword, and that nick of steel, which is missing in his sword, is the stuff embedded in her uncle's thigh when the body came home. But he reconciles them all, and the queen says, I will not kill you, because, again, this whole chivalric, noble thing, I've already told you you're a guest in my house, I'm not going to come back on that no matter what you did to my brother. He says, I will save you from unsuitable suitors. I can wed you to a king, to my uncle. I will sort everything out, and they agree, and so then they get on a boat back to Cornwall. Iseult to be married to Mark. Her mother gives a love potion to Iseult's handmaid to be given to Iseult and Mark so that they would love each other forever. And Iseult at this time is is hating Tristan rather. She's not particularly enjoying.
You killed my uncle and now you're forcing me to marry your uncle.
Yeah, it's all a bit of a meh. And but as fate would have it, everyone gets a bit seasick, and Iseult and Tristan are looking for something to drink. And they drink the love potion. Uh-oh. Against all of their will, against everything else, they completely fall head over heels in love with each other. And it is destined. There is no way they're ever going to get out of it. They've fallen in love totally. On the way back on the ship, they consummate their love. They're having this pure relationship. And then there's a whole issue when they get back, and she's not going to bleed on her wedding night, and so they ask the maidservant who didn't hide the love potion well enough to take her place in the marriage bed, like a whole thing. And then we go into a whole extra next cycle of quests and loves, and King Mark half suspecting something but not, and them constantly almost about to be discovered, and then they find out a clever ruse to make people believe they don't actually love each other and aren't sleeping together. It's really actually similar again to the Lancelot, Guinevere, Arthur triangle. Eventually, after all of this, Tristan goes like, I can't do this anymore, and so leaves forever. He goes to another court of Caden, which is on an island in the middle of the Channel, and marries his sister Isolde of the White Hands. There are a lot of Isoldes in this story. But they never consummate the marriage, and everyone's wondering why and what and who, and because he's still absolutely in love with Isolde, but isn't, it's wrong love, so And eventually, he is wounded by a poisoned spear again, tells Caden that the only person who'd be able to heal him is Isolde, and explains the whole situation of his love with her and why why he's left, even though he's married to Caden's sister, and tells Caden to go and ask Isolde if she'll come and heal him. And on the way back, if she's coming, raise a white sail, and if she's not, raise a black. So he's trying to hang on, fighting for dear life. And eventually, Caden does go and fetch Isolde, and she immediately comes the minute she hears about this. And so he's sailing in with a white sail. But Tristan's wife, Isolde, hears this plan, and in a fit of jealous rage, she tells Tristan that they're flying a black flag rather than a white. So he dies grieving for Isolde, who he believes has abandoned him. A few minutes later, that classic thing,
she enters
just when they almost could have been it. She comes in, and Isolde comes ashore and dies next to him because she believes he couldn't wait for him. And where they are buried together, and roses grow above them, entwined.
That's actually a really nice story in a horrible way, but I was expecting some weird. I mean, I think because we had Terence staging where it's like ya la 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 ya, but that's actually just a really nice story. I mean, it's a bit fantastical with the love potions and everything, but it feels like it follows a structure of a story that we are used to.
Yeah, and it feels weirdly relevant. It feels right. It feels like a multifaceted story, which I would read today. I think is it's really interesting just how modern it feels in a way. I love this poetry, actually. Just like the stories, it is extraordinary because we think, oh well, the fact that these stories still exist from the 1100s and in such wonderful variety and ways of telling and this kind of thing, it's amazing.
No, I agree with you. I think it's so, like you say, I would definitely read this type of story today. And it does feel a bit kind of the type of story, not quite like I was going to say like a Greek myth, but then this is a sort of myth. That sort of level of this happens and there's loads of characters and there's fights, but it's still like a romance novel, like a historical romance type thing.
Exactly. And also, I think the other point is that thinking about it, most of our stories nowadays, unless they are a full series following someone's life, you have a happy ever after at a certain point. Yeah.
I'm a fan, Naima. I'm a fan. I like it. I enjoyed.
I'm a fan too. It's all through.
I liked it. I really liked it. I think that's possibly one of my favourite stories we've had. Yeah.
No, I agree. It's a really fun. Yeah. Makes you feel quite nice.
Yeah, it feels quite soothing, even though it's got a lot of fights and a lot of killings of people. And so scoring. Let's move on to the scoring. So we score every theatre style in 4 separate categories: sleight of hand, scandal, ripple or riot, and legacy. We each give a score out of 10 for each category, leading to a maximum total of 80. Finally, we decide whether it deserves a place in the House of Revels. So the first category is sleight of hand. Here we explore the stagecraft of the theatre style, the props, tricks, trapdoors. Take it away, Mingma. What have we got?
All that fun stuff. So again, this is the problem is that quite a lot of the sleights of hand are very fun. But we've also mentioned them about 12 times by this point because the style of storytelling isn't changing much. But there is some fun stuff in this area in particular. One thing is particularly wordplay and allegory and all this kind of stuff. So I found a quite interesting article comparing a new fragment of the story of Tristan and Isolde to which was found in 1997 to the original poem. One of the most convincing evidence of its authenticity of being part of the original poem is the wordplay on la mer in Norman French, obviously, which is used as a crucial moment when Isolde simultaneously veils and unveils her love through the multiple meanings of this word. So this is right at the point when they've drunk the potion and they've suddenly realised they've fallen in love because of the potion. And there's a whole question in it about whether they really loved each other. And for Isolde, it seems to be pointing to the fact that she doesn't, that apart from the potion, she wouldn't have fallen in love with him. And so the multiple meanings of this word la mer, it's bitterness is one meaning for it. Another is the sea, la mer, and also love, l'amour. So there's a really interesting wordplay in the choices of the words they use and in their structure to give across her bitterness at the fact that this is happening, the fact they are on the sea at this moment, and also the love which is now burgeoning. I mean, also just talk about some multi-layered storying going on in just one word.
It's a lot happening in that one La Mer word.
So another kind of example of wordplay is actually that Tantris, the minstrel, is the two. This is written in octosyllabic couplets. So what they did in the poem was that they just swapped the two syllables of his name.
I was going to say, when you were reading it, I did think,
Yeah, and actually original line is her just saying Tantris Tristan, Tantris Tristan, and that's how she realizes that he is the man who killed Morold once she sees the sword and recognizes it all. Which is quite, again, just like showing the wordplay and the cleverness of what's going on. And also allegory, we have to mention, this idea of the honeysuckle and of roses and like the amount of imagery, which again, as we said last time, we were looking at the weasel.
The weasel!
Which is, I think, one of our favourite moments recently. We have no idea the amount of allegory and metaphor which all these people would have known as their popular culture reference points, which are going on in here. Other main bit is that there are really kind of three main types of troubadour poetic structure, and I think there are poetic examples of matters of Britain in all three. And the first is trobar-lieu, which is light poetry, and it's meant to be easily accessible, and it's the most popular style, but not necessarily the easiest to do. And I actually think that Tristan, this poem, is a trobar-lieu. And so that gives an idea that that's considered simple wordplay.
Yeah. What have we got in store for the other ones?
Yeah. So trobar-clou is a closed form and is meant to be very complex and obscure. And I get the impression from it that it's only the in the know will get. So like cryptic crosswords, you have to be educated to understand it and all this kind of stuff. And the final one is trobar-ric, which feels like it's halfway through. It has more verbal gymnastics than trobar-lieu, but also outlasts trobar-clou, but never gains the popularity of the other one. So it feels like it's the halfway house between the two. So yes, that's one big thing. Another one is music. Again, we keep on saying and keep on emphasising the fact that we see them as poems, but these would have been written for music as well. They were written as songs. And we actually have some more evidence for it in this example. As we already said, when Tristan is pretending to be Tantris the minstrel, he is sitting there at death's door in his boat playing his harp. And then later on, he tutors the daughter in music, and they sing and they talk about how beautiful she sounds while singing along to his accompaniment. Yeah. To me, that is a clear stage direction
of someone, playing a song and singing.
Yes. And to me, that also says duets. Are they doing stage directions of duets? And the fact people might,
husband and wife
a man
team.
and a woman might quite often tell this story together. I could see that. There's also one of revisiting but also clarifying the structures of troubadours at this time. So there's a gentle point about knowing one's audience, engaging space. So these are, we're talking about stories here, but we think about the people performing it. Troubadours quite often mean courtly poets, so they will, and quite often they're aristocrats themselves who might perform their own work and would probably know their space incredibly well. They would always perform in the same hall, they would know their audience, they'd know what they liked, disliked, and so they could probably change the story slightly or really work out which story they should tell for a particular evening, depending on who's around.
Feel the vibe.
Exactly, they all know all of the courtly politics that's going on. While actually minstrels and jongleurs were the journeying folk. These terms of minstrel and jongleur and troubadour change throughout time. So there is a lot of kind of confusion about what each term means at different times. The other side of all of this is, in terms of sleight of hand, is accessibility and changing the stories for each person you're with. And as we said, this is fan fiction, so people are continually writing. And I've mentioned a lot of authors in the matter of Britain, but there are countless, many anonymous poems which have survived to today. And to me, that says, were those the stories the minstrels were singing? So we know the great courtly troubadours, but perhaps it's the anonymous ones which are the ones which are being told in the taverns and were being really performed and recurtailed. And
again, it's that thing of like, oh, there's not that much, and then there is suddenly quite a lot. I think, it's important not to underestimate the power of music. And I do like this wordplay of the Tristan, Tantris, and the allegory. And I guess it goes back to that thing of, is it just a song? Is it just quite a fancy song? We don't, props and eccentric masks and performing dogs and...
No, we don't. I think it's definitely... these poems, as we said, were incredibly long, and so they must have been doing something to engage people for 2.5 hours. Perhaps it might have just been background noise for them while they're drinking and eating, but I don't think so.
So there must have been something to grab people's attention. What are you thinking in terms of scoring, then?
It's really tough because I'm so in love with this style at the moment.
But you have to detach personal. You have to detach the personal and the professional.
Like we've done that at all so far.
No, we've not done that at all.
I think 5.5. I think.
Okay. I was actually going to say, I was going to say 5.
I think a half for the fact of duets. I think just pushes it that much further.
Yeah, the duets. Yeah. And I do really like the actual story itself, but then that's not a sleight of hand. 10.5 in total. So moving on to Scandal. So here we discuss the juicy gossip of the theatre style. Please tell me there was juicy gossip. Because I feel like we never have any juicy gossip.
Well, yeah, I think this time we're finally getting somewhere with the Scandal side.
Yes.
The first little thing is Jean Baudel, who is the one who gave the title of this style of Matter of Britain. He contracted leprosy, which I'm not sure is scandal, but it has to go somewhere. That he died in a leper's house, which I think is quite tough.
Yeah, it's quite tough.
So that's number 1. Number 2 is adultery, as we keep on saying. Just like, it's so hard. I think we said we were going to judge it from nowadays, or at least try to. Just like the whole courtly love thing is so hard to understand. It's just our whole worldview is so different.
Because I think maybe it's better to be in love and in pain than be angry and wild. Do you know what I mean?
I suppose. Yes, yeah, it does. It's tough. But yes, I think it still needs to be in there. The fact that this kind of love triangle and that it's entirely right is so odd to us. It does need to be in there. But there are 2 more little things, which is remembering that a lot of this is told in court, especially the poems we know nowadays. I think there is a lot of kind of like slight side-eye of court gossip. And one of those is, as we heard in the Tristan and Isolde story, that he was going to fetch Isolde for his uncle. There is a bit of juicy gossip with the fact that that basically Eleanor of Aquitaine was at one point meant to marry Henry II's uncle. Also, Henry II was at one point in conversations to marry her daughter.
Also, didn't Eleanor of Aquitaine have an affair with her uncle?
Yes,
possibly?
a different uncle. So not Henry's uncle, but another
a different
uncle.
So there's a lot of uncle business.
Uncle monkey business. And I think there's a clear thing of slight side-eye of a story right at the beginning of their reign when everyone knows this and she's 11 years older than the king. And the final little other kind of scandalous thing is that the story of King Lear, which we haven't touched on much in this podcast, but around he divides his kingdom in 3 to give to Goneril, to Regan and to Cordelia, and it all just goes completely tits up, as Shakespeare tells. Henry II himself did a Lear.
Quite a lot of kings are doing Lears, aren't they, though?
Except that Henry's sons also behave like Lear's daughters, which is why it just kind of gets so...
What happens? Do they gouge out someone's eyes?
No, so Henry's sons are Richard the Lionheart, King John, and Gregory, and I can't remember his surname of some sort, just Gregory, perhaps Greg. Greg the Third.
Gregory Greg.
And he divides up his kingdom amongst his sons, and they immediately start rebelling against him with their mother's help. There's a bit of scandal going on with, are the stories helping him with his ideals and the ideals backfire in the way of the stories, or are the stories reflecting what the hell's going on at the time? And, scandal.
That is quite scandalous. Yeah, the King Lear, and I guess King Lear was probably written then because everyone was used to this idea of a division of kingdom.
Which, the division of kingdom was more of a European trait, as we said, than it was a British trait. And it seems that every time a Brit tried to do it, it ends in a disaster of some sort.
Maybe Scandal's not... I was going to say, maybe Scandal's not solo then, but that's what I always say every episode. But, yeah.
Oh, I think Scandal's pretty big for this one.
It does sound pretty big.
Yeah. I think part of it of Scandal is also what's happening on stage and off, and I can definitely see that it's the court gossip who's kind of putting in XY of certain relationships into their stories. In a side-eye of, of this and that.
I think maybe a 7 for me for Scandal.
Yeah, I think I'll join you on 7.
So, ripple or riot then? Here we judge whether this style caused a ripple or a riot. How socially controversial was its existence and content? Did it spark wider conversations? So, give us the lowdown.
Arthuriana was very useful to Henry II. He was a British messiah, and as depicted by Geoffrey of Monmouth, this idea, Geoffrey of Monmouth is the first person to do this thing of him going to Avalon and then might return at the time when he is most needed. And this Breton chief could become a model for all Christian knights. As we've said, Henry II and Eleanor were incredibly scholarly and wanted effectively soft power of ways to transform people's behaviour, not necessarily through decree. In his fabled court, he could materialize this perfect idea of a feudal idea of social harmony. It was a perfect way of saying, we're going to return to the way that Arthur did things, rather than just saying, I'm making up something new. These stories are the earliest known body of patriotic myth for Britain as a country. We all need our national stories, and this is effectively nationalism reforming the British identity through saying, this is your lineage, this is our heritage.
This is who we are.
Yeah. And the final kind of little point on that is that Wace in 1155, the Roman de Brute, is the one who adds the round table to the Arthurian myth. The idea of the round table is that then everyone is equal by sitting at that table. No one is given preferential treatment by being on your right hand or your left. The king is opposite everyone. So again, you can see a lot of political talks and all this kind of slight soft power through the stories. So that's the first one. And the other kind of big bit of Ripple and Riot, I'd say, is it's quite extraordinary the number of people contributing to the genre from all around Europe. Geoffrey Monmouth wrote in 1135, and by 1190 we have Germans like Wolfram von Eichenbach and Gottfried von Strasbourg and Ulrich von Stratzikoven, who all introduce different elements. Ulrich introduces Lancelot's Lady of the Lake upbringing, that he was brought up by fays and then he's brought into it. All this stuff which begins to be part of a much greater Arthurian myth all come from all these different areas. Italians like Resticello da Pisa, who's known for writing Marco Polo's biography, that's the most famous one of his known works, again is adding to this. Countless French, Norman, English people, all in different languages, all in German and Italian. Talk about a cultural ripple that just kind of went straight across the entirety of Europe. Very fast for a time when all news had to go on horseback.
Yeah. So it not only had it spread, it had also become popular.
Yeah. And remember that Britain was a province of a greater Plantagenet empire, and the fact that, as we've said before, the fact that this was up there with Charlemagne and with classical Rome is enormous for cultural identity and homogeny and people recognising Britain as a cultural thing. As we said, the anonymous poems, clearly this was also popular not just in courts. There is so much which has remained that clearly just across Europe this was making enormous waves.
So huge actually for influence and popularity
and usefulness. The place it falls down on is that I think we always thought with Ripple or Riot is this about kind of changing it quite warlikely. I think in a way of thinking about modern day protest theatre, which it's not, but it also is changing society in a much more fluid and lower way.
Yeah, I think that's how we have to think of it in terms of changing society. From the sounds of it, it really did change society. I mean, the matter of Britain, the idea of filling in the history and the fact that you say it spread it. So I think a large ripple.
a large wave, I think, is what we're going for.
A large wave, yeah.
I think it's high, honestly.
I think it's high too.
I'd almost say 8, I think.
Okay. I'm going to give it a 7.5 because I hate to be the same. No, I'm joking. I know, I think it did have a big influence, but I'm wary of giving it higher than 7.5 because I think there'll be bigger things which cause bigger riots.
Oh yeah, bigger waves.
Huge waves.
Yeah.
This is a big wave. I mean, it's not quite a tornado.
Yeah. No, I'm sure that 10 we'll find the absolute one which caused riots in the streets, and that's the one.
We might even have to go above 10 at some point. We'll be like,
yeah.
So that brings us to a total of 15.5 for Ripple or Riot then. So moving on to legacy.
Nice.
So how has this theatre style influenced the future? And also remember that we talk about not just influencing future theatre, but influencing the future in general. Just for listeners out there.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think you can think of any bigger legacy, really. Arthur. Can we think of how many countless adaptations there have been of all the stories, all the editions, all the reinterpretations? It might have lapsed a little like Shakespeare did, but then it came back with a massive bang in the 1800s. We focused on the matter of Britain in terms of being 1150 to 1200, roughly around now. But even in the next 200 years, there are so many extra editions. And then when Hollywood gets going... but think about how many Hollywood films there are. I think every decade, at least, there is one King Arthur story of some sort. Or Merlin, or a retelling of this or that. The operas which have been made about this music. You know, I know about Tristan and Isolde because of classical music, because someone's written, you know, songs literally of this story. The amount of tourism to Glastonbury, the magic, the stories that have come out of it. Shakespeare, Cymbeline, King Lear all come from the same source of the Matter of Britain, which we've been writing about at this time. We're talking about Arthur, but there's also all of that stuff as well. So many tropes.
So much. And if I have to be completely honest with myself, before we did this podcast, what had I heard of from our past subjects? I'd heard of Arthur, and I knew a bit about Roman theatre in terms of the things we've covered. And that's it. I think most people, even if they know nothing about theatre or history, or everyone has pretty much heard of the legend of Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and Excalibur and the Sword and the Stone and Lancelot and Guinevere and, you know, Merlin and everything. I mean, it's huge, actually, when you actually think about it. It kind of rivals Shakespeare in a way.
In terms of the amount it is affected and gone to, and, you know, for something to have such a hold on popular imagination and just,
9.5. That's what I'm going to give it. Poof.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. I think it's just...
I think the only thing we'd probably have to consider, though, is how popular has it been in the interim between the Matter of Britain and now? Which I know is a bit of a silly question because we obviously know about it, so it obviously existed. But has it always been in the psyche of...
Well, yes, it's a really interesting point that it's... so I tried very hard to stay to the very, very early versions here, but there are many poems which are in the 13th and 14th century, so the next 200 years of it, it just continues. People keep on spewing and keep on adding and keep on all the rest of it. Then there's less because Black Death doesn't help, and then we have Mallory, who almost kind of brings together the Morte d'Arthur, you know, the kind of greatest kind of compilation. And if people think about the Arthurian legends, they seem to think that it starts with Mallory, but they don't know about this enormous stuff beforehand. There is a lapse around the 18th century, but it's literally a century. That being said, think about the dragons in this story and think about all of these people. I'm certain that even though the high theatre weren't doing it, think about the maypole dances and the rural stories and the pageant plays and the pantomimes and the performing in the streets and all this kind of stuff. I'm fairly certain it never has gone from this country.
No, I'd agree with you. Actually. And the fact it's something that you can't pinpoint the first time you learnt about it. Like, I couldn't tell you the first time I learnt about Shakespeare or the first time I really grasped the concept of death. Like, it's one of those things that you just know. I love that I went to Shakespeare and then death.
Or I do distinctly remember actually watching the Sword and the Stone, you know, the Disney film of it. I remember being very young and watching it and knowing this isn't the original. So I don't know when I knew what the original was, or even if I knew what the original is. But where is that psyche? Where is that moment that this is so part of our culture? Yeah. You know.
So it's pretty big. So let's stay at 9.5 then. So
9.5.
It's 59 out of 80.
Oh wow!
Which is our biggest score.
By a long way, I think, as well, isn't it?
By a long way. Okay, so that leads us to the really big question then, Ingna. So does it belong in the esteemed and noble House of Revels?
I mean, undoubtedly, for me. There's no way I'm not going to say yes.
Fair enough.
I know that it's this problem of of stagecraft and of the fact that it's actually quite similar to normal theatre styles and this thing, but I think there is difference. I think that the fact of the duetting and the music and the way the music might have been used in a particular form, that hasn't entered House of Revels yet, I don't think.
No, not yet.
And also just the stories that will rocket around the halls from this.
It belongs. Yes, it belongs there. It has made it into the House of Revels.
Yay! Is that only our
That is our second addition to the House of Revels.
Amazing. Oh, so after however long poor old Fireside has been sitting there alone.
11,000. No, not 11,000. No. Yes, 11,000. No.
1,100. Not...
No, 1,100 years. I was like, no, yes, no. What? 1,100 years. No. There's been something else. Okay, so that's it. We've just covered the Matter of Britain. Well, perhaps not all of it, but as much as we can.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can rate and review us and press subscribe to stay up to date on all the latest episodes.
Have you got a nugget about this style that you'd like to share? We'd love to hear from you. You can get in touch via our social media. On Twitter and YouTube, we are House of Revels, and on Instagram, we are House of Revels with underscores. We are also now on Facebook. If you type in House of Revels into the little search bar, we will pop up. So press like over there.
Very exciting. Or, you can be old school and drop us an email at houseofrevelspodcast@gmail.com.
Oh, thank you very much for listening to this extremely interesting episode all about the matter of Britain. I'm just pumped that we've got something else in the House of Revels.
So am I. Oh, and it's so well deserved. Anyway, yes, so see you next time.
See you next time.
Bye. I'm actually I've loved researching this. Really, really loved it.
I can tell you enjoyed it.
Yeah.